I'm Brooke O'Harra, and I'm a director, a theater director, experimental theater and opera director, and performance maker. And I ran a theater company in New York for 15 years. Also ran a live lesbian serial drama in New York for a while. And Sharon and I are partners, and we have a kid, and we made this show together. And we've also made other performance works together. We currently live in Philadelphia.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much. I'm Sharon Hayes. And a shout out and super special thanks to Stokely for initiating this conversation. Also, of course, to Leon, Melissa, to DJ for setting this up. I'm an artist. I do performance-based work. I tend to kind of work around queer genealogies and often with sort of anachronism as a certain kind of temporal operation. And I think in collaboration with Brooke, some of my own relationships to temporal strategies get shuffled up, and that'll be really nice to talk about. I wanted to just give you a little bit of a sense. Oh, also just it's super, like what a pleasure and privilege to be a part of this conversation. So thank you all for being a part of it. Thank you for being here. What we're gonna do today is, a special part of this is for us to be able to be in dialogue with Heather Love, who is somebody who Brooke and Heather collaborate in the teaching space. Heather is a part of our kind of ongoing conversations, and we've had a lot of dialogue about this particular work, and Heather has also been an audience member to this work and a participant in a part of it. So Heather has a kind of, a super special set of anchors that make it really exciting to have her in this conversation. So what we're gonna do today is that Heather is gonna start with about 10 minutes of just framing discussion about Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse so that we make no assumptions about what people may know about that novel. And Brooke and I are gonna do a super succinct 10 minutes describing the work Time Passes. And then we're gonna invite two performers up to do a demonstration of 16 minutes of what is an 8-hour and 59-minute work.
7 hours.
7 hours and 57 minutes. Oh God, it feels so much like 8 hours and 59 minutes. That is a particular scene called the dinner scene that we do invite people from the audience to come up and perform that in the space of the 8 hours. And then we're gonna talk a little amongst ourselves, and we really, it's super important to us to have conversation with you all, so we'll leave 25 minutes at the very latest for that.
Okay, thanks you guys, thanks for inviting me. I'm a professor of English. I'm really only performance adjacent, partly through these guys, but I actually am trained in modernism and in the novel, and I've been reading To the Lighthouse like over and over again since I was maybe 14. So when I found out that my dear friends Brooke and Sharon were making this huge performance around it, it was just like a kind of fantasy for me. And so I want to talk a little bit about the book just to frame it, because that is the text for this performance, which you'll hear more about, just so people are familiar with it. And I guess it's a really interesting novel in terms of time, so we're going to want to talk about how time works in the novel a little bit, but I also want to be attentive to the novel in time. Like, I feel like I've aged along with that novel. I've been reading it for 40-some years, and also, obviously, it's aged in history, right? So it's a complex thing that I want to talk about. I'm just going to give you a slight plot summary. There's not a lot of plot because it really is mostly about what people are thinking and thinking about each other. But it was written in 1927, and it covers this period from 1910 to 1920. And it's famously in 3 parts. So the first part is called The Window, and it's about this family, the Ramseys, and Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey were kind of based loosely on Woolf's parents, and they have 8 kids, and it finds them at their summer house in the Hebrides in the Isle of Skye. And they also have a bunch of house guests around. The dad is a philosophy professor, and sort of some ambitious young men are there, also just assorted house guests. And probably the most important house guest for our purposes would be Lily Briscoe, who's a young painter, who's doing a portrait of Mrs. Ramsay and her young son, James. And the drama of this whole time is that they want to go, that James in particular, this young kid, wants to go to the Lighthouse, and his dad says he can't. And that section of the book ends with a dinner party, and that's what you'll see some of today is from that party. And it's just a really important scene where Mrs. Ramsay is kind of like the life-giving force of this family. But Woolf is not at all straightforward in her celebration, I would say. It's really a kind of critique of the family and of the sort of affective labor that women have to do in heterosexuality, but also specifically in the family. So that's section 1. Section 2 is called Time Passes, and it's from a kind of outside perspective. Some people say it's narrated by this actual summer house, but during this 10-year gap that's just a few pages, World War I happens, Mrs. Ramsay dies, 2 of the kids die, and it's sort of narrated like from the house's perspective and also from the housekeeper, right? Because there's a class element here, and it's a part where the housekeeper kind of comes into focus. And in the final section, which is called, so that section is called Time Passes, and you guys have named your piece after this middle section, this sort of short dilation of a few pages into the space of 10 years. The last section is called To the Lighthouse, and Mrs. Ramsay is dead, but Mr. Ramsay does finally sail with his 2 kids, James and Cam, to the Lighthouse. And meanwhile, Lily Briscoe is back. She's 10 years older, and she was painting a picture of Mrs. Ramsay and James. They're no longer there, but she finishes her painting as they land at the Lighthouse. So that's the story, such as it is. It's a sort of a modernist classic. I wanted to, you guys have a sense who didn't know the book, what it's basically about. But also, I just wanted to say a few things about why I think it's important in the context of this conversation. And, like we've had a few kind of texts from that period mentioned, like Bergson was one, and we were also thinking about Bataille, right? And Virginia Woolf also from this earlier moment, but I think in a way she sort of anticipated a lot of the things that we're talking about here. It's an old book. There's plenty of blind spots in it, I would say, about like class and race and empire. But I think Virginia Woolf's feminism and the particular quality of her feminism, we can really trace a line of that to many of the things that we think about now in terms of a queer critique of the family or sort of thinking about sociality, anti-normativity. I mean, she was on all of that, and that's really in the text. And just to say, like, I think around questions of duration or temporality, you can actually trace a pretty specific line, because a lot of the queer thinking that people are mentioning around queer time, like by Beth Freeman or Jose Munoz, really does come out of like feminist narrative theory, and basically it came out of like critics reading To the Lighthouse in a sense, right? Like she sort of anticipates the things that we're talking about now, because, well, Leon's mention of Bergson is very relevant, because Bergson kind of talked about the sort of subjective experience of time, and this book is all about that. It's really narrated always through people's perspective, and time expands, it contracts, it jumps ahead, and it's really, you really lose the sense that there is a sort of objective clock time, because it's all filtered through people's experience. And it's a pretty profound experience of that, and I think that's something that Brooke and Sharon have really taken up with. So, a very good illustration of that idea of duration as a kind of subjective experience of time. I would also say it's really a scene of sort of queer relationality. It's about a family, but it's really about the kind of misery and incompleteness of a family and a marriage, I would say. And there is this sort of loose collection of individuals there, and that's really where the interest is. It's really a novel about people thinking and thinking about each other, and thinking about these kind of partial connections that, you know, are maybe not sanctified, but last over time and how they change. And it's really about that. And just finally, just to point out one other thing that I think might be a way that this novel sort of anticipates things that we're thinking about is I might call like a queer aesthetic. Again, it's sort of about people's perception of reality rather than some objective reality. And, you know, they go to the lighthouse, they get to the lighthouse, but really the drama is about Lily finishing her painting and how does she perceive this family. It's really through the eyes of this painter who, you know, is a kind of stand-in for Woolf, I would say, with her feminism, her sort of critical view, and her attempt to sort of put the world into some kind of form and make it meaningful. And that's kind of the drama of the book. And that's very connected to Lily Briscoe's love of Mrs. Ramsay, which is kind of the sort of central affective note of the novel, I would say. And a part of her coming to finish the painting has to do with her sort of confrontation with the loss of Mrs. Ramsay. There's just, Brooke and I were talking this morning about how this moment where she kind of silently cries out, Mrs. Ramsay, to want and not to have, to want and not to have. This is kind of at this moment of sort of the loss of the object that she is actually able to finish the painting. So I think there is a kind of queer aesthetics of loss at the center of the novel, which, you know, also has to do with duration. But in all of these ways, I think that, you know, this now, you know, almost 100-year-old text really speaks to a lot of the things that we are thinking about and talking about these last couple days.
All right. Thank you, Heather. So I'm just going to quickly tell you a few things about the project. So the way the project, I guess you can, do I need to lean in? The way the project works is we do the entire book up to the Lighthouse, and we used a book on CD that I picked up used at this bookstore in Northampton when I used to teach at Mount Holyoke College. And I used to have to commute back and forth from New York to Mount Holyoke sometimes several times a week because I have rehearsal in New York and I'd have to teach at Mount Holyoke, and we had a place in New York. So I listened to a lot of books on CD. And I just picked this up off the table for like $3. And so, well, there's, okay, I'll jump back to that. But when I was listening to the book, what really struck me is when you're listening to something in the car, like this is now something we normally do. This is like before Spotify and podcasts and all these other things. Like, but so we're kind of now used to constantly listening to stories. But when we listen to something in that enclosed world, you really get inside of it, right? And the thing that kind of blew my mind as I was listening to it was Mrs. Ramsay and her constant moving into these internal conversations, like in dialogue. So she would be, she's in this scene, she's in this domestic scene, she's holding conversations with people, and the dinner scene, she's kind of holding court, and yet she's actually having conversations with people in her head at the same time. And I do think this is, even while I was listening to it, I would start to like have an internal monologue towards somebody as I was listening to the book, and I became sort of obsessed with that as speech, as like a kind of outward speech that's internal, and how does that translate into performance, like in a way that's different than a monologue or a soliloquy or an aside, but like you're speaking, and that the people you're speaking to and these conversations that you have with people that you never have with people, and that sort of is also in this space constantly, and in the space of a car, I really was like, there must be a way to perform this. The other quick thing was about duration. When I proposed this project to Sharon, I was like, okay, we have to do it has to be the whole thing. Like, everyone has to stay for the 8 hours, because actually that's also part of it. It's about time, and that it is build. I'll explain the performance in a minute, but as you are together in time, it's called Time Passes. There's something about the building of something, and I actually have always understood that, because as a theater director, I don't think of my work as something you can just step into for 10 minutes and step out of. And once Sharon and I started dating, I would spend a lot more time in, like, I've always spent time in museums and galleries, but
art contexts.
in performance inside of art contexts. And the biggest, like, huge thing was she was in a show with some other collaborators at the Tate Modern, this larger show called 9 Scripts from a Nation at War. And one of the parts of the show was this 4-hour performance of...
So, yeah, we did a 4.5-hour public reading of 10 transcripts from the combatant status review tribunals that took place secretly and with great coercion in Guantanamo Bay. And a 10 tribunal excerpt lasted about 4.5 hours, and we had a cast that just rotated from position to position. So every time a tribunal would end, they would shift seats. So they were never character driven. They were really reading the translation of the transcript, or the highly translated transcripts.
And the positions were like...
witness, detainee, tribunal member 1, tribunal member 2, president, and then
lawyer.
Well, there was no lawyer, in fact.
There was, and there was never a witness, so the people would be able to call a witness, but that person would have to be found in Iraq or wherever and somehow brought to Guantanamo to, like, serve the space. So there would always be this empty space. But I sat, because I'm like a theater person at heart, I, like, sat there at the Tate. There was a theater, and I sat there for 4.5 hours, because, like, in my mind, you watch the whole 4.5 hours. And actually, what you learn from watching 4.5 hours of these tribunals, like one after the other, the kind of speech, then you really understand. Like, it's almost like 4.5 hours is just the beginning of, like, what it must have been, this experience. But the audience, otherwise, were like Tate Modern visitors. So they would just come in and they'd sit for like 20 minutes, or some people sat for an hour, and then they'd leave. And I was actually
tortured.
I was going to say shook by, like, what the kind of loss of, like, what you don't learn and what you can't understand, and then also in relation to the assumption of the viewer of, like, what they saw or what it is. So when Sharon was like, we can't ask people to stay for 8 hours, I was like, yeah, no. They actually have to stay for 8 hours, but we can make it good. We can offer up, like, babysitting, free babysitting, actually, in the building, and we can offer the price of admissions is a potluck item, and so there's food, and we can order coffee every 2 hours, and we can ask people to bring their yoga mats and blankets and pillows and knitting. And we can have books available for people to follow along, and we can make a space that people can move around in and occupy and, like, live in as we're performing. So we can be gracious, but we also are going to show the time code, so you know at minute 1 that you're going to be here for 7 hours and 56 more minutes, and you're going to watch the minutes slowly tick by. So that was that. So really quickly, this is the potluck. This is, so far we've done the show 2 times. The first time we did it, I was 8.5 months pregnant. We did it at the Performing Garage in New York, and what we do is, Sharon is Lily Briscoe, and I'm Mrs. Ramsey, and we took this book on tape, and we cut out the audio for every time one of us speaks or speaks inside of our brains, is talking to ourselves or someone else in thought. And we just cut that out, and then we built these time-coded scripts where we like rehearse speaking those things. But then we also, the script is full of lists. Virginia Woolf loved making lists, and in her first version of the script, she'd even just write other lists, like grocery shopping lists and lists of things she needed to get done that day into her first draft of the book. And so we kind of set up a world, a system where we would perform these scenes, but we also had an 8-hour video of a tide coming in and out. Sharon makes a work, and at first she painted a painting as Lily Briscoe, and then the second time we did it, she actually makes a work of her own, like a Sharon Hayes piece that she made called Join Us, over the course of the show. Our dog played James. But then the next time we did it, our daughter was 7. She wasn't in the womb anymore. So she played the other children, and our dog was also in that. And also, like, a dog has time differently than a person and needs people who will come and take him out for a walk, etc. Yeah, and then it wasn't until the second time that we had the dinner scene where we brought other people in to sort of try to play with this script. Our daughter sung and danced and did all kinds of things. There was a lot of things happening. Here you go.
So I'll talk really briefly about process and lead us into this demonstration. So one of the things, this is, I think Brooke and I, because we both work with performance, but in different genres in essence, or inside of different modes of distribution. I was also thinking about the kind of question of distribution. We have a different relationship to making and to process. So Brooke has worked with really sort of thorough rehearsal process, very often with some of the work that I'm doing, particularly when I'm using myself, or particularly when the work is happening on the street. I don't rehearse it. I might memorize something, but I don't do what is a kind of classic rehearsal, because to rehearse the work is already to do the work, to pull in all, if the idea is that you bring in all of the elements to kind of stage them so you know how to kind of move through them. If I were to do that, then I'm already in the space of the performance of the work. And I think in this piece there was something that kind of met those two. It's not really possible. It wasn't possible for us to rehearse 7 hours and 57 minutes of a work in the way that theater does, where you kind of break it into parts, then you put those parts together, then you run that whole thing again and again and again. And yet we also had to understand what it was. So in some ways I would say we started to make the work by making this script and the audio, sort of the extracted audio score that accompanies it, and then we would take certain pieces of this into a studio to try to understand what is the material of this novel through the book, through our kind of performing with it, in a sense, like to be the words of Lily Briscoe and the words of Mrs. Ramsey is in essence to perform with it rather than to perform it. So we weren't out to make a theatrical piece that is this book. We were sort of out to study it and to maybe engage a process as a work and to engage the work of process. So at a certain point we then invited the audience into that. And then we always thought we would do it for 10 years. And it's hard to do. It's hard to do for all of the reasons that we have been talking about that would be nice to talk more about. So we did it a second time. When we did it a second time, there's one, when we did it a second time with our daughter, we did rehearse with her, so that much of the rehearsal is just about kind of trying to learn how to perform rather than sort of what to perform. So it's a little bit of a methodology. So in the second one, as Brooke said, the piece that I was doing was a piece called Join Us, and is a piece that's composed of 450 political flyers from a whole range of kind of moments of protest or political action. And so I think what was happening in the space in New York was, in Philly was really different than what was happening in the space in New York in some ways because of the catching of historical time. the presence of our daughter. And then in some ways the decline of our dog, which was apparent also. Our dog was aging. So what we're going to do, and then importantly, the intersection of, or the bringing people into the dinner scene. The dinner scene in total duration is how long, Brooke?
It's an hour and 15 minutes.
So we're going to perform 16 minutes of it with 2 volunteers. And we're going to perform 16 minutes at the very beginning of the dinner scene, which crosses over 2 chapters. So we'll begin sort of at the end of what is chapter 16 in part 1, and you'll hear the audio book voice say 17, and that's chapter 17 that then begins. Dinner scene. Do you 2 want to just introduce yourselves briefly?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Maxime. I am a member of the Brown Arts Institute Arts Crew. I work with Melissa and was invited to be part of this work. And I'm very excited to be supporting queer durations and participating in this.
And Maxine is reading for Charles Tansley.
Thank you.
I'm Thomas Choinacky. I'm a choreographer who lives in Philadelphia.
Thomas is reading for William Banks.
Okay, here we go.
Mrs. Ramsey.
So she must go down and begin dinner and wait. And like some queen who, finding her people gathered in the hall, looks down upon them and descends among them and acknowledges their tributes silently and accepts their devotion and their prostration before her, Paul didn't move a muscle but looked straight before him as she passed. She went down and crossed the hall and bowed her head very slightly, as if she accepted what they couldn't say, their tribute to her beauty. But she stopped. There was a smell of burning.
Could they have let the boeuf and daube overboil?
She wondered.
Pray heaven not.
When the great clangor of the gong announced solemnly, authoritatively, that all those scattered about in attics, in bedrooms, on little perches of their own, reading, writing, putting the last smooth to their hair or fastening dresses, must leave all that, and the little odds and ends on their washing tables and dressing tables, and the novels on the bed tables, and the diaries which were so private, and assemble in the dining room for dinner. 17.
But what have I done with my life?
Thought Mrs. Ramsay, taking her place at the head of the table and looking at all the plates, making white circles on it.
William, sit by me.
She said.
Lily?
She said wearily.
Over there. They had that.
Paul Rayleigh and Minta Doyle.
And she, only this, an infinitely long table and plates and knives.
At the far end was her husband, sitting down, all in a heap, frowning.
What at? She did not know. She did not mind. She could not understand how she ever felt any emotion or affection for him. She had a strange sense of being past everything, through everything,
As she helped
out
the soup.
of everything. As if there was an eddy there, and one could be in it or one could be out of it. And she was out of it. It's all come to an end.
She thought, while they came in one after another. Charles Tansley,
Sit there, please.
she said, Augustus Carmichael, and sat down. And meanwhile she waited, passively, for someone to answer her, for something to happen,
But this is not a thing
she thought, ladling out soup.
that one says.
Raising her eyebrows at the discrepancy, that was what she was thinking, this was what she was doing, ladling out soup. She felt more and more strongly outside that eddy, or as if a shade had fallen and robbed of colour, she saw things truly.
The room
She looked round it.
was very shabby. There was no beauty anywhere.
She forbore to look at Mr. Tansley.
Nothing seemed to have merged They all were separate.
And the whole of the effort of merging and flowing and creating rested on her. Again, she felt, as a fact, without hostility,
the sterility of men. For if she did not do it, nobody would do it.
And so, giving herself the little shake that one gives a watch that has stopped, the old familiar pulse began beating as the watch begins ticking.
1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and so on, and so on.
She repeated, listening to it, sheltering and fostering the still feeble pulse, as one might guard a weak flame with a newspaper.
And so then,
she concluded, addressing herself by bending silently in his direction to William Banks,
poor man,
who had no wife and no children and dined alone in lodgings except for tonight, and in pity for him, life being now strong enough to bear her on again, she began all this business, as a sailor, not without weariness, sees the wind fill his sail, and yet hardly wants to be off again, and thinks how, had the ship sunk, he would have whirled round and found rest on the floor of the sea.
Did you find your letters? I told them to put them in the hall for you,
she said to William Banks. Lily Briscoe watched her drifting into that strange no-man's land, where to follow people is impossible, and yet their going inflicts such a chill on those who watch them that they always try at least to follow them with their eyes, as one follows a fading ship until the sails have sunk beneath the horizon.
How old she looks. How worn she looks.
Lily thought.
And how remote.
Then, when she turned to William Banks, smiling, it was as if the ship had turned and the sun had struck its sails again, and Lily thought with some amusement, because she was relieved.
Why does she pity him?
For that was the impression she gave when she told him that his letters were in the hall.
Poor William Banks, she seemed to be saying.
As if her own weariness had been partly pitying people, and the life in her, her resolve to live again, had been stirred by pity.
And it was not true,
Lily thought.
It was one of those misjudgments of hers that seemed to be instinctive and to arise from some need of her own rather than of other people's. He's not in the least pitiable. He has his work.
Lily said to herself.
That she
remembered, all of a sudden, as if she had found a treasure.
That she had her work.
In a flash, she saw her picture and thought,
yes, I shall put the tree further in the middle. Then I shall avoid that awkward space. That's what I shall do. That's what's been puzzling me.
She took up the salt cellar and put it down again on a flower in pattern in the tablecloth, so as to remind herself to move the tree.
It's odd that one scarcely gets anything worth having by post, yet one always wants one's letters,
said Mr. Banks.
What damned rot they talk,
thought Charles Tansley, laying down his spoon precisely in the middle of his plate, which he had swept clean.
As if,
Lily thought. He sat opposite to her with his back to the window, precisely in the middle of view.
He were determined to make sure of his meals. Everything about him had that meager fixity, that bare unloveliness. But nevertheless, the fact remained, it was almost impossible to dislike anyone if one looked at them.
She liked his eyes.
They were deep, blue, frightening.
Do you write any letters, Mr. Tansley?
Asked Mrs. Ramsay.
Pitying him,
Lily
too.
supposed.
For that was true of Mrs. Ramsay. She pitied men always, as if they lacked something. Women never, as if they had something.
He wrote to his mother. Otherwise, he did not suppose he wrote one letter a month,
said Mr. Tansley, shortly.
For he was not going to talk the sort of rot these people wanted him to talk. He was not going to be condescended to by these silly women. He had been reading in his room, and now he came down, and it all seemed to him silly, superficial, flimsy. Why did they dress? He had come down in his ordinary clothes. He had not got any dress clothes. One never gets anything worth having by post. That was the sort of thing they were always saying. They made men say that sort of thing. Yes, it was pretty well true.
He thought.
They never got anything worth having from one year's end to another. They did nothing but talk, 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 eat, eat, eat. It was the women's fault. Women made civilization impossible with all their charm, all their silliness. No going to the Lighthouse tomorrow, Mrs. Ramsay,
He said, asserting himself.
He liked her. He admired her. He still thought of the man in the drainpipe looking up at her, but he felt it necessary to assert himself.
He was really...
Lily Briscoe thought, in spite of his eyes.
But then, look at his nose. Look at his hands. The most uncharming human being she had ever met. Then why did she mind what he said? Women can't write, women can't paint. What did that matter coming from him? Since clearly it was not true to him, but for some reason helpful to him. And that is why he said it. Why did her whole being bow like corn under a wind and erect itself again from this abasement, only with a great and rather painful effort?
She must make it once more.
There's the sprig on the tablecloth. There's my painting. I must move the tree to the middle. That matters, nothing else. She could not hold fast to that.
She asked herself.
And not lose her temper and not argue. And if she wanted revenge, take it by laughing at him. Oh, Mr. Tansley,
She said.
Do take me to the Lighthouse with you. I should so love it.
She was telling lies. He could see. She was saying what she did not mean to annoy him for some reason. She was laughing at him. He was in his old flannel trousers. He had no others. He felt very rough and isolated and lonely. He knew that she was trying to tease him for some reason. She didn't want to go to the Lighthouse with him. She despised him. So did Prue Ramsay. So did they all. But he was not to be made a fool of by women.
So he turned deliberately in his chair and looked out of the window and said, all in a jerk, very rudely,
It would be too rough for her tomorrow. She would be sick. It annoyed him that she should have made him speak like that with Mrs. Ramsay listening. If only he could be alone in his room, working.
he thought.
Among his books. That was where he felt at ease. And he had never run a penny into debt. He had never cost his father a penny since he was 15. He had helped them at home. Out of his savings, he was educating his sister. Still, he wished he had known how to answer Miss Briscoe properly. He wished it had not come out all in a jerk like that. You'd be sick. He wished he could think of something to say to Mrs. Ramsay, something which would show her he was not just a dry prig. That was what they all thought him.
He turned to her. But Mrs. Ramsay was talking about people he'd never heard of to William Banks.
Yes, take it away.
She said briefly, interrupting what she was saying to Mr. Banks to speak to the maid.
It must have been 20 years ago that I saw her last.
She was saying, turning back to him again as if she couldn't lose a moment of their talk, for she was absorbed by what they were saying.
So he had actually heard from her this evening. And was Carrie still living in Marlow? And was everything still the same? Oh, she could remember it as if it was yesterday, going on the river and feeling very cold. But if the Mannings were to make a plan, they stuck to it. Never should she forget Herbert killing a wasp on his teaspoon like that. Oh, and it was still going on.
Mrs. Ramsay mused, gliding like a ghost among the chairs and tables of that drawing-room on the banks of the Thames, where she had been so very, very cold 20 years ago. But now she went among them like a ghost, and it fascinated her, as if, while she had changed, that particular day, now become very still and beautiful, had remained there all these years.
Had Carrie written to him herself?
She asked.
Yes, she says they're building a new billiard room.
He said.
No, that was out of the question, building a billiard room.
It seemed to her impossible.
There was
Mr. Banks couldn't see that.
there was there was anything very odd about it. They were very well off now. She should have given her
said
love
Mrs.
to
Ramsay
Carrie.
with a little start.
Oh, no.
She added, reflecting that she didn't know this Carrie who built a new billiard room.
How strange.
She repeated, to Mr. Banks's amusement.
That they should be going on there still, for it was extraordinary to think that they had been capable of going on living all these years when she had not thought of them more than once that whole time. How eventful her own life had been during those same years. Yet perhaps Carrie Manning hadn't thought about her either. Well, that was strange and kind of distasteful thought.
People soon drift apart.
Said Mr. Banks, feeling, however, some satisfaction when he thought that,
After all he knew, both the Mannings and the Ramsays, he had not drifted apart.
he thought, laying down his spoon and wiping his clean-shaven lips punctiliously.
But perhaps he was rather unusual.
He thought, in this.
He had never let himself get into a groove. He had friends in all circles.
Mrs. Ramsay had to break off here to tell the maid something about keeping food hot. That was why he preferred dining alone. All those interruptions annoyed him,
Well,
thought William Banks, preserving a demeanour of exquisite courtesy and merely spreading the fingers of his left hand on the tablecloth as a mechanic examines a tool beautifully polished and ready for use in an interval of leisure.
such are the sacrifices one's friends ask of one. It would have hurt her if he had refused to come, but it was not worth it for him.
Looking at his hand, he thought that if he had been alone, dinner would have been almost over now. He would have been free to work.
Yes,
He thought
it is a terrible waste of time.
the children were dropping in still.
I wish one of you would run up to Roger's room.
Mrs. Ramsay was saying.
How trifling it all is. How boring it all is.
He thought.
Compared with the other thing, work.
Here he sat, drumming his fingers on the tablecloth, when he might have been. He took a flashing bird's-eye view of his work.
What a waste of time it all was, to be sure.
He thought.
Yet, she is one of my oldest friends. I am by way of being devoted to her. Yet now, at this moment, her presence meant absolutely nothing to him. Her beauty meant nothing to him. Her sitting with her little boy at the window, nothing. Nothing. He wished only to be alone and to take up that book. He felt uncomfortable. He felt treacherous, that he could sit by her side and feel nothing for her.
The truth was that he did not enjoy family lunch.
Okay.
So she must go down.
Yeah, I think because you guys were just doing the dinner table scene, I was thinking about what you said, Brooke, about like we could make people stay there, but it could also be nice. Because, Mrs. Ramsay is sort of responsible for wanting things to be nice. And it's reminding me a bit of the conversation about, which we've sort of had, but sort of not, about duration versus endurance and sort of your goals for the audience and sort of how you feel about the length of the performance and the audience's experience, let's say, and your own experience. I mean, it's not an art of extremity. It's a kind of domestic scene, and it was quite relaxing to be in the audience, actually. I'll just say that from my experience of it. So I guess, it's sort of about, just maybe I'm putting it in terms of like endurance versus just duration, and sort of how you think about, I was very struck by what Julie said about sort of
Wasting time.
but also
Yeah.
waste in terms of wasting time, but also the ruin.
Yeah.
And it does seem like there's sort of different aims here to this performance. So just, I don't know, any of that.
Yeah, I think that in some ways it's been really interesting to hear discussions of endurance and with everybody to kind of keep parsing through what duration is. Like duration in kind of, for me as a time-based media person, tends to be thought of as real time. And I think one of the things that I have always understood about real time is that it's so many times going on at once. It's not chronological. It's not linear. It's not normative. It's circulating, or so many different moments are circulating. So I think I did have a great anxiety about sort of this first proposal. Brooke also from theater refers to it sometimes as a captive audience. I have a lot of anxiety about making, kind of making and performing in that kind of context, although I did begin my work in that way. But I think one of the things that became interesting for me as we moved into that is we had no idea what that time would be. So it's not like we were making a proposal to a group of people about what that time would be. We were making a proposal to a group of people to be inside of that time with us. And to allow for whatever happened during that time, and to try to give them as much sort of elbow room as possible to do what they needed to do inside of that kind of their saying yes, like they essentially said yes to it.
But we also, I mean, there was a kind of endurance to it for us because we weren't only tracking the script, and I speak over 3 hours of that 8 hours as Mrs. Ramsey. But also we had like all these tasks. So we were like turning the pages in the book. We were making these works. Like I was dancing with Alice at one point. Alice plays the piano. We're making those lists constantly and shooting them across and taking them up. And you're making the artwork. So we had a kind of task-based script in addition to our time-based script, and like so every minute was kind of, our scripts have like tons of notes, like what we're supposed to be doing at every given minute, and we could never rehearse the whole 8 hours in one. We'd rehearse sections of it, but it is, so for us, I don't know if it's palpable to the audience, and maybe they also would stay there with us, because for us it was actually, some endurance was involved.
I mean,
Especially when I was pregnant.
I guess the other part of your question that is interesting is to think about what we were inside of, and in some ways we were inside of the book on tape or the book on CD. In other ways, we were inside of Virginia Woolf's kind of work. In other ways, we were inside of like contemplations of domesticity. And we started the work when we were 40. I mean, we're 3 years apart, but 40 and a little under 40. And that felt something of like, yeah, there was anxiety about having a kid. There was anxiety about both like whatever anxiety, like can you care for this little being, but also like what it means to to sign up for family, like to kind of make a choice to do that. So I think that the time spent, we in a way, it was that not a lot actively happened, actually.
But there also, okay, sorry, one more thing about time and duration. We were supposed to do this in Glasgow this summer, 2020. So as you know, it didn't happen, and then we were supposed to do it during the Glasgow International last summer, and we literally the funding fell through, Brexit and many other things. But we have this idea of like doing it till we die, and so that also is like how time passes, and like this kind of duration and domesticity, and our daughter getting older. She's not here because she was in a musical. She's 13.
She's not here because she's 13.
And our dog died. And our other dog is here, but we didn't want to bring him to the show.
I mean, because as I kind of suggested, part of my reading of the novel is like as a totally fascinating, ambivalent take on families, family life, which is sort of, in a way the most important thing, but also completely marginal and critiqued quite harshly. So that's interesting that, it was sort of like, some potential of kind of working through that very question. But I just wanted to maybe ask you guys in a non-creepy way if you could talk about, collaborating and being a couple, which, I'm always interested in that. Tavi and I both talked to Matmos a lot about that. That's something that, I find super interesting. Collaboration is hard, but, and the sort of durational performance of being in a couple, that whole issue. So, so I don't know if you could talk about the sort of creative process and maybe if doing this long project that you want to last for your whole lives sort of changed your sense of each other's work or what it meant to collaborate and what. Okay, well, just say what you want.
Well, okay, first of all, I'm a director, so I think I work in this way of like a choice or doing something that, like, making a choice helps me understand if it's a bad choice. So I wanted to like make decisions and be like, okay, let's do this, this, and this. And Sharon likes to sit in an idea for a long time before it gets locked in. But then I'm like, well, we have to rehearse something, so we can get rid of the decision, but we have to make it. And that we learn, like, that's actually a huge difference of ways of working, where it's like I would just start to like want to give up if I couldn't make a decision, I couldn't learn what something was. And you were like, well, what? Let's think about what it is. I can't think about it. I need to do it.
I mean, in a certain way, I don't know if this is like me taking the bait, but collaboration is always almost impossible. And I don't think we work particularly well together. And yet, I think they work really well together, but yet we keep going. So that's kind of, I'm not sure what that is or what that produces, and I'm I'm actually quite interested in it as an artist. I'm maybe less interested in it as a partner and lover.
No, but that's actually not true. We work really well together when it's one of our projects. If it's my project and Sharon's helping me, she's really great at helping and participating. And if it's Sharon's project and I'm helping her, I'm really good at helping and participating and showing up. When it's both of ours and we're that's where it gets hard, where one of us isn't the boss and like the subservient to the other in a way and just helping the other.
But I guess this does, in a way that it kind of trails out to some of the questions that we've been talking about over these last days. There is something, I did a 9-hour reading of these presidential addresses, and I remember Yvonne Rainer saying to me, like, well, who gets anything out of that except you? And I do think there is something with durational performance. There is really an interiority and an exteriority, and they're very different. So I think the experience Brooke and even Alice and I were having was really different than that of the audience. And that is something that, in a way, it gives me certain anxiety, because it's not the same difference in other works of mine, where I'm really thinking a lot about the ways in which the work gets then left on its own to interact with an audience. But in this, I think maybe that's what I was trying to say about it's not a work in progress. It's an always working in process or progress. And that's, I think that brings up actually some pretty significant questions for performance, because what does that do, Does it do something on the outside? Does it do something sort of for an exterior encounter? Or is it something that, we should just be doing it in our own house and not letting it out into the world?
Yeah.
Should you be doing it just in your own house and not letting it out into the world?
No, because we never do it.
I mean, it's the way you introduced the work today, Brooke, was kind of about inside and outside, right? And what you say and what you don't say. And I mean, I guess another sort of proposal that I had about the novel was that, it's called To the Lighthouse, but them arriving at the lighthouse is sort of less important from Lily finishing her painting. Like that it's really about the sort of, it's about the artwork and it's about the perception and the sort of inhabitation of that through an aesthetic lens. But I guess, I wonder if we could put sort of words like dwelling or something alongside endurance. It seems like, you're sort of you were kind of asking your audience to like live in that room.
Yeah. I think that there is something, that's true. We're asking for a container of time. And in the scheme of things, that's one of the things that's interesting about some of the institutional, like technologies, I was saying this last night, technologies have capacities, durational capacities and durational incapacities. And that means that certain things can appear inside of certain technologies or certain time. A duration can appear in a technology and it can not appear. It just, you can't fit that much speech on an LP, like on one side of an LP. And I do think there's something about technology and its relationship to history that is kind of constantly, for me, that is part of the interest in also kind of moving with this work and moving with this work into the future. I guess that what relates there is that there's so much about this, like, I don't particularly identify with Lily Briscoe or with Mrs. Ramsey. There's nothing in this novel that is is a kind of process of identification with me. In many ways, I disidentify, and yet there's really deep investments I have in my work and in the way I came to political consciousness that has to do with the relationship between the so-called intimate sphere and the so-called public sphere, and that as a space of leakiness, that as a space of leak or blur or bleed. And so for me, what I found myself thinking about with this attempt to finish the painting is this impossibility of taking what is seen in one's head and moving it outside. Yeah.
And the other thing that became really clear is it's not like the play to the Lighthouse. It really is not. It is a different experience than the novel. And the thing, even though whether or not we're amazing, we are good collaborators, but it's that we actually feel quite exposed by the end as a family. And you also are very aware of us as like women artists. I think the thing is really happening over the course of that as time passing is like this kind of, like watching us as women artists, like working through this and watching us in a kind of version of domesticity and care for the audience and care for each other that runs parallel to the story.
Well, I guess I would maybe say as like dyke artists, as like white dyke artists.